So, I think among those who are present, I think Rosinka will remember that in 2006 I had given a seminar, and I was trying to formulate in that seminar how modernity, for instance, colonial modernity in Bengal in particular, the trajectory of that modernity could be theorized in some other way. And my thesis in that presentation and published elsewhere is that while classical modernity, for instance, in Weber, it has been charted as the plotting of a journey from the personal to the impersonal, right? From status to contract. And what I tried to show is through taking a particular case study and using Brajendranath Sheel and Hiralal Haldar, Keshab Sen, Rammohun Roy, that it was basically a journey from natural personality to what I shall formulate later, more on that, to juridical or artificial personality, or from the question of individuals to the question of the organizations, right? Now, having said that, I mean, it will get more clear when I pick this up. I tried to show through the reading of Keshab Sen's reading of Rammohun, for instance. Keshab Chandra Sen was meditating on Rammohun's personality, and he was to argue that Rammohun Roy's multiple personality or multiple selves actually helped to bring in the multiple universality in Rammohun Roy's thought. A multi-universality, even multi-religious kind of bringing that was so very peculiar to Rammohun's thought. It was a kind of multiple self in Rammohun Roy, Christian, Islam, everything. Now, Keshab Chandra Sen, when actually Brahmo Samaj was in sort of crisis, Keshab Sen, astounded everyone by reading that it is not through an appeal made to the personality of Rammohun Roy, but instead he made an appeal to the trust deed of the Brahmo Samaj. He tried to read the spirit of Brahmo Samaj and many other organizations by making a sort of meticulous, close reading of the trust deed. But after that, having arrived at the principle of organization, which Brajen Sheel was to categorically mention that this is the principle of organization. Having arrived at that later, when himself, Keshab Sen, was in trouble about a marriage, as you know, that was very famous, he was to appeal to personal conscience and all kinds of stuff. And later, that split is very famous. When the other people actually argued that Keshab Sen had violated the principles of organization. Principles of Brahmo Samaj had been, this kind of principles to which Rammohun Roy himself had taken recourse, right? He was accused of, violating those same principles. And then I had to argue, obviously, that by that time, the institution had taken, spirit of its own, kind of a ghostly apparition by which an institution could parade itself as, a kind of the question of embodied spirit. After there is this reading of Marx and all, it's already famous. So organization then, takes on its own spirit. And so beginning with that, so much that Keshab Sen, all others had to, bow down to those. Keshab Sen didn't have any argument against the question of principles, Even Max Muller intervened, but he couldn't do anything about it. So, starting with that if it is plotting of the personal to the impersonal, then in colonial modernity or elsewhere also, it could be shown that this kind of impersonal, procedural, formal, rules, procedures by which modernity arrives universally, sort of, in the Weberian charting and all others, was violated in the sense that transitory, whimsical, irrational, personal intervened and interrupted this journey. So I tried to argue that it is basically a journey from the natural personality by which individuals are described to the personality of organizations, the principle of organizations. And then one could show that how the principle of organization had immanently kind of very personal principles which were trying to sort of, acting as a subtext of those principles of organizations, organizational principles. Now, having said that, I mean, if this plotting is somewhat enduring enough or convincing enough, then the second part was this, that in the 19th century itself, I mean, this question of organization, institutional principles, even, I mean, when we say that the institution has a life of its own, it has rules of its own, and parades as a separate entity, then in legal thought, particularly in medieval legal thought, for instance, deriving from classical, you have the notion of juristic, personality or legal personality, where organizations are described in this manner, actually. And the consequence of this kind of argument is dangerous, to say the least, because... Yes, welcome, Manu. Yes, to, put up a helpful fillip. So I was trying to chart the trajectory of an alternative reading of modernity, by which I try to show that the personal to impersonal journey, as charted by Weber, for instance, gets interrupted by a subtext of the personal, interrupting organizations and institutions. And it is basically a journey from personality to personality, but from the natural personality, realm of natural personality, by which individualism could be, plotted, marked, and described, to artificial legal personality or personality of institutions. Right? Now, in the 19th century, this was a sort of grave topic, grave debate, and deriving its spirit from the medieval theorists, the scholastics, and jurists. The participants of this debate were, of course, Brogenschild was there, but as you know, Brogenschild was erudite enough, but it was Hiralal Haldar who used to be stacked in the drawing room of Brogenschild, as Binoy Sarkar tells us in an Adda session. But it was Hiralal Haldar who, in those days, in 1893, 1894, got published in Philosophical Review, published from New York, and he was perhaps the only one who has had such kind of internationally recognized scholarship, and his book Neo-Hegelianism was published by Heath Cranton of London in those days. And he was pretty, Brogenschild, of course, was interesting, making stray, interesting remarks, but Hiralal Haldar was rigorous, as you will find. So what I'm trying to, in this part, second part, of course, after 10 years, I'm trying to sort of hold on to that thesis, of course. And the second part is here, that Haldar got into a debate with MacTaggart. MacTaggart was an adversary of Russell, and he was a neo-Hegelian himself. And makes very interesting point, which was, after Haldar was, taken up, picked up by later theorists and nationalists, of course. And the consequences are even, could be, sort of pulled to define and describe contemporary thinking as well. So, Haldar actually starts here, okay? Listen. He says that my attention was directed to the phenomenon of multiple personality, and the problem arose in my mind. Now remember, this question of multiple personality was first brooked by Keshab Sen while describing Rammohun Roy, right? Now Haldar picks it up here. The question of multiple personality and the problem arose in my mind. That the question of absolute, Hegel's absolute. As you know, Hegel's absolute, before I get on to how Haldar tries to define and engage with absolute, but a bit of preliminary remarks, as much as I could make. Now, Hegel's absolute is a sort of dominant paradigm and dominant metaphor in the whole Hegelian discourse. By absolute simple, it's not that absolute means, everything which is sort of overarching, high roof, a meta-narrative. It's not that kind of. In terms of Hegel's logic, it's a very necessary concept metaphor, by which what Hegel tries to make is a kind of where actually, suppose I say I know, then I try to combine what you call being and concept together. Now, this is a great actual achievement for Hegel, because before Hegel, being and nothing, or being and concept, a distinction was, sort of paraded and marked. With Hegel, these distinctions are there, they're not lost. But through certain kinds of mediation, they are brought into a unity and then they are fractured. So, absolute in a sense, it includes everything, but without excluding everything. Suppose I make a difference between, race and caste, say individual and individual and group. Now, there will be a kind of bigger umbrella, a bigger circle within which this distinction is included. Otherwise, we would not be able to make the sense of this distinction, right? So in Hegelian terms, the absolute is this. One might say this is close to the Kantian transcendental, but it is not so, right? So by absolute, it doesn't really mean the way we understand absolute in the ordinary sense, because this is why Hegel was critiquing, when Hegel was critiquing Schelling, he tried to say that Schilling's absolute is, when all cows are black. So it's not that. In Hegel, absolute means for our absolute spirit is there, absolute mind is there, but simply put, by which, through certain forms of mediation, the concept and being, everything is included in an overarching kind of concept, but all differences are preserved in that kind of concept, right? Now, Hiralal Haldar says, the phenomenon of multiple personality, which was used by Keshab to critique, to describe Rammohun's, universal appeal and kind of achievement. Problem arose in my mind. Hegel, after all, does not teach that the absolute is a unitary personality. His real theory is that the absolute is a unity differentiated into persons. Now, the simple understanding of absolute, as it comes around in Haldar also, to describe absolute as a kind of a very mundane, elemental name for God, though this is not a clear description, but still. Absolute is a unity differentiated into persons. What I thought that, absolute is a unity differentiated into selves, but absolute is a self-conscious unity of its constituent selves. He is trying to argue that absolute, all differentiated selves are there. All of us are here differently, fine together, right? But the premise, the circle that contains us, we say we all have personalities. But the circle that contains us, does that circle have a personality? This is Haldar's problem, right? Now, according to Haldar, McTaggart, against whom he was militating, the parts have no meaning but the unity, while the unity again has no meaning but its differentiation. This should be the illustrative ground of the absolute being a unity of persons, where the parts have no meaning but their unity. Now, McTaggart elsewhere cites the example of a citizen, who is a citizen only his relation to other fellow citizens. If we take the later away, the former becomes non-existent. Now, McTaggart actually tend to argue this, argued against this, McTaggart's central example, the main part of his arguments revolves around a college. He says, I know that I am. I know that a college cannot say I am. It does not follow from this, however, that the absolute is a person. It might be said of a college with as much truth as it has been said of the absolute, that it is a unity, that it is a unity of spirit, and that none of that spirit exists except as personal. Yet the college is not a person. It is a unity of persons, but it is not a person itself. Now, elsewhere, of course, McTaggart elaborates on how this is more impossible. All individuals are finite selves marked by a consciousness of the non-ego, not I. But the absolute sustains in itself both the ego and the non-ego, and therefore cannot be reduced to any of this. If I say I am an ego, then outside there will be a non-ego. But the absolute, it contains both the non-ego. There will be no outside, right? Now, Haldar, I'm just trying to sort of summarize the argument and get to the sort of more illustrative examples. Now, Haldar tried to argue the whole is in each part and is equal to the part. Now, if the whole, insofar as it is in the part, is personal and can say I am, how can the whole itself be impersonal? This is Haldar's question. I mean, if there's a whole, the parts are there. All parts can say I am. All parts, personality can be claimed for the parts. So if all of the parts can be claimed as personal, how can the whole itself be, indifferent to the phenomena of the personal and claim that it is impersonal? The part is the whole and it is self-conscious. So must the whole be. This is Haldar's argument. He is saying this. If my eyes see a thing, I see it. If my ears hear a sound, I hear it. So if the absolute is a person in me, it must itself have a person. McTaggart, you remember that college clause, which Haldar is arguing here. Now, we call ourselves persons, but no one, I believe, has ever proposed to call a football team a person. But if we now call the absolute a person, we should have no defense for refusing the name to the football team. This was what McTaggart will argue, that the football team is also a person. For it shares its imperfection with human beings and its want of a direct sense of self with the absolute. Haldar answers. He says, the relation, however, of the absolute of its constituent individuals, I mean the example of college is sort of misplaced, because when a college or a football team, it's a very purposive union of individuals. They come together and they can sort of dissolve themselves. The whole, football team can break up. So though the example is sort of ill-gotten, but still I'll try to argue. This is what Haldar is saying. And he says that the unity of football team is no other than the community of purposes. Fine. Now, what he says is, when we say that the absolute, it has both ego and non-ego, the essential condition of self-consciousness is opposition and not the externality of the non-ego. The absolute, of course, has nothing outside it from which it can distinguish itself. But from this, it does not follow that within it there is no non-ego, in distinction from which it has the consciousness of self. In the absolute, all its differences are united but not lost. They retain their characteristics. The absolute, which says I in each of its determinations, has self-consciousness insofar as these egos are brought together in its unity. Right? So, in the absolute, I have the ego is there, the non-ego is there. Not necessarily there will have to be an ego outside. McTaggart was trying to argue that if you project as a person, then you have to have ego outside. Right? He says if absolute, ego and non-egos are united, but also there could be an opposition. Ego and non-ego could be united in opposition within the absolute. Right? I don't have to project something external. Okay?
Let me stop you here, because you are carrying on this point for quite some time. Can you actually reduce the Hegelian concept of absolute to a part-whole dialectics? Can you? Because there is obviously a sense of transcendence, and you are saying that you want to avoid that part. When something sort of transcends this part-whole. When I say being part of a team that I am, then and when the whole says that I am, something has transcended. And which is that absolute? and which is the critique against Hegel, that the absolute actually liquidates the parts in it, because it has acquired a different persona for itself, which is different from the persona of the parts. So there is a clear sense of transcendence, and Hegel was happy with it. Hegel's notion of history as absolute is a history of transcendence. So I'm just keep this in mind. Keep
of
this
course.
in mind.
I mean,
We can talk
so far as part-hole is there, I mean, as you know, I mean, this kind of part-hole becomes essential problematic in Husserl's logical investigations. He devotes parts, I mean, chapters after chapters on this, and where, kind of independent parts, dependent parts, there this kind of interrelationality and the transcendence becomes absolutely a logical problem, which is resolved later in some form. But let us follow what Haldar is trying to argue. Now, he says, the absolute which says I in each of its determinations has self-consciousness insofar as these egos are brought together in its unity. Putting aside the debate on the absolute and pressing upon more on the college consciousness, the emergence of the group personality with the group mind, we are trying to hold on to that part where this debate is there. It generates a kind of sociological insight where this becomes a problem in social and legal thought particularly, that whether groups are have individual personality in terms of firms and corporations in legal thought later, as Ambedkar will talk about castes as corporations, or civic mind as corporations, or corporate spirit, corporate independence by Nivedita. Because the question, I mean, pinpoint, let us try to focus it. The question of the personality of the group, for instance, the caste. When we say a caste member, now the caste personality of a member, will it be different from the personality of the caste as a group? Now, this was a question which was debated between Ambedkar and Gandhi, for instance. Those examples are there where Ambedkar tries to argue that a good Brahmin, you cannot have a good Brahmin as such. You cannot have a good master. You cannot, right? So he's trying to deny the virtuosity of the group as such, because you try to imbibe that as, so the separate, civil, social, and now in terms of group rights and individual rights, those liberal arguments where you try to argue that why is there, a right of exit for a religious member or even a caste member, an independent right of without conversion, an independent right of exit. Now these problems are there, even I mean, these are legal juridical problems also, right? So, right. We come to the question of group personality, the group mind, deriving ourselves from the Haldar-McTaggart debate. Now, following Liebon, for instance, Freud describes to begin with the group as a provisional being, which, though being formed by heterogeneous individuals, projects a homogeneous character in the wake of a racial unconscious, and which puts them in possession of a sort of collective mind. As you know, in Durkheim, for instance, you lot on collective mind, collective representations, which makes them feel, think, and act in a manner quite different from that in which each individual of them would feel, think, and act very in a state of isolation, which Manuzda was trying to point out through the example of transcendence. The individual acquires new characteristics attributed by Liebon and cited by Freud to the factors of, firstly, kind of automatic responsibility caused by the disappearance of conscience. Secondly, contagion, where the transmission of the acts and sentiments of the group to the individual leads to the submission and sacrifice of individual interest to collective interest. Thirdly, the vanishing of conscious personality while being submerged in a state of hypnotic fascination marked by a loss of individual will and discernment and acquiring thus an unconscious group personality. This is Freud's term, unconscious group personality. And you say, I mean, hypnotic fascination, even you'll remember, I mean, in terms of the German fascist and Nazis kind of Hitlerian upsurge and the group hypnosis, even Adorno made much of this, right? So this is absolutely relevant and picked up by later theorists. However, Haldar, having had no Freud at his disposal in neo-Hegelianism, advertently tries to trace precursors to this thinking by engaging with a number of neo-Hegelians. Here he has turned his torch on Bernard Bosanquet. Bosanquet says, human beings are not merely legal persons or mutually exclusive selves. The presupposition of them as personalities possessing rights is the social spirit, which is itself not the final form of individuality, but one of its subforms. Now, Haldar could anticipate the argument of the anti-communitarians of today, who would urge in favor of a liberal, unencumbered self, not grounded in a reproducible sociality. Haldar quotes Bentham at his best. There is no hard and fast distinction between it and its environment. You cannot say where self ends and environment begins. And finally comes the demolition of privacy and the private, to which we shall be making references. He says, however private and incommensurable feelings may be, they are never complete by themselves, but imply a universal objective content. The pure privacy and incommensurability of feeling as such is superseded in all possible degrees by the self. Transcendence and universality of the contents with which it is unified. This universalism, as we have predicted, in a reference to a particular theorist, Andrew said, but the concept metaphor, self-transcendence, is important. It refers to the communicative a priori of each linguistic content in enunciation. This also grants infinitude to limited self in interaction, and this contamination makes duties or rights impure. Quote, the finite selves are independent beings at arm's length with one another, although connected by the relations of right and duty. It is not realized that they are also infinite and are therefore always beyond themselves. Pure duty and whole rights can never be fulfilled. Haldar, in fact, reveals Bosanquet's idea of state action as public action not to be judged by the same standard as private action. In fact, Haldar goes on to argue that state sovereignty is a mirage rightly to be denigrated. It is just another association of probably a limited life. Now, this particular argument has clear precursors in medieval political and legal thought, where state was being argued as just another kind of voluntary association. There could be many associations, church and those other, right? State is just another association which could be dissolved anytime. It is not that these associations which will subscribe to the authority of the state. So Haldar is clearly making that kind of an argument. State sovereignty is a mirage rightly to be denigrated. It's just another association of probably a limited life. And in this view, Haldar is correct in arguing that group persons are, as parts, could well be persons within the wholesome personality of the state, where the state lives off in all of them singularly and yet simultaneously. Now, as we say, as I was trying to make, that this debate did not make clearly, though, as you say, the notion of juristic personality, artificial persons, where institutions have artificial persons, though there was reference to this kind of thinking, but typical medieval corporations and juristic personality was not referred to in particular. So the theory that was lost to it. The debate, strangely, does not impact upon the notion of fictitious or legal juristic personality that was available since the Middle Ages. Now, the argument was made in those days, which Pollock and Maitland quotes through via the German jurist Otto von Guericke, that if the church is spiritualized, it becomes a person, and you may say an ideal juristic person. Now, a body of 20 or 2,000 or 200,000 men bind themselves together to act in a particular way, in fact to form a club, for instance, for some common purpose. They create a body which by no fiction of law, but by the very nature of things, differs from the individuals of whom it is constituted. Now, the line of advance is no longer from, this kind of juristic personality they're trying to accomplish. One is, of course, that state is just another form of association, right? Secondly, whether the moment we try to trace ourselves to, natural kind of natural law in those days, for instance, natural law, natural personality and all kinds of stuff, they were trying to argue, of course, that these institutions, many institutions, are created simply by law, simply by fiat of law. Now, they have a personality of their own, right? But if a natural person does not identify it as someone other than himself, would it be the same as he, in other words? He would identify an absolute similarity or difference. And the difference, for that matter, would be vouched by a simple mechanism of a legal operation, by a founding law. There could still be nature, but it is something other than natural. We could name it, for the moment, cultural, and leave it at that. In our context, let us pick up Maitland's invocation of group personality. On group personality, similarly, Maitland has this to say. If the law allows men to form permanently organized groups, those groups will be for common opinion, right, and duty-bearing unit. Group personality is no purely legal phenomenon. The lawgiver may say that it does not exist, whereas a matter of moral sentiment, it does exist. If he wishes to smash a group, let him smash it. But if he is going to tolerate the group, he must recognize its personality. Remember, this kind of argument in terms of today's groups, communities, they are rehearsed in some form or the other. This concept was forcefully invoked by Maitland to explain 19th century Europe. And Maine's description of status to contract has become standard taxonomy in sociological, political, social philosophical circles. Maitland rejects it in favor of an astounding new twist. He says, the line of advance is no longer from status to contract, but through contract to something that contract cannot explain. This is very important. No longer from status to contract, but through contract to something that contract cannot explain, and for which our best inadequate name is the personality of an organized group. But isn't it a striking coincidence that Ambedkar, and before that Sister Nivedita, would invoke such a concept, sometimes in its exact coinage, to describe colonial and post-colonial moments of institutional ego? Now, here we come to the more contemporary part. So far as the subversion of universal forms of impersonal civil society is concerned in the colony and the post-colony, our thesis has been, and that which has been lost sight of, is the invocation of a group personality, legal or juristic personality, to do away with impersonal and private both, where personal emerges as a separate entity besides private and public, and personal is not private. But in the case of Nivedita, while it comes through the curious metaphor of the civic personality of the city, it cannot, and I hope it does not, wish away an essential contractarian tradition mooted in the Rousseauian form. In Rousseau, where Rousseau talks about public persons, while he tries to describe city, which Rousseau says is called republic or body politic. Now, Sister Nivedita and her civic mind. Sister Nivedita begins by contrasting the epic spirit of Mahabharata and Ramayana, by noting the contrasting, pervading interests of the Mahabharata, which are heroic and national, those of the Ramayana mainly personal and civic. Nivedita finds that, quote, there is nothing in all Indian literature of greater significance for the modern Indian mind than the scene in which Hanuman contends in the darkness with the woman who guards the gates, saying in muffled tones, I am the city of Lanka. We have here what is called the fundamental need of the civic spirit, that we should think of our city as a being, a personality, sacred, beautiful, and beloved, unquote. To Nivedita, this was the habit of relating himself instinctively. This was the, quote, habit of relating himself instinctively to his home, his sovereign, and his group, unquote. The city is then an extension of the person and his or her family. Quote, what we call public spirit is simply the reflex in a given personality of the civic consciousness. That is to say, public spirit is the expression of that character which is born of constantly placing the ego with the same intensity as in the family in a more complex group. Nivedita, of course, ends up with an interrogation. What then is the fundamental bond that welds so many and various elements into the single communal personality, unquote. Now, today's communal personality in today's, India would absolutely evoke strange sentiments. But fine. And her answer is simple, yet very, very complex and far-fetched. She approaches the answer first by denying the two dominant spatial metaphors of industrial capitalism, which she finds are of pathetic significance in this respect. Quote, the railway station and the general post office, which form features of the central place. Now, to Nivedita, the place is not simply a demarcated space. The place is a visible evidence of the civic unity. Central place in the Europe of our times, and the condemnation here is sort of cutting. Quote, how eloquent is such an arrangement of the fact that home has been abandoned in favor of a world of going and coming, a temporary foothold for the bird of passage, unquote. Now, after this denouncement should come Nivedita's answer to what is the bondage that reaps the civic mind. Quote, does it not lie in the equal relation of each of these to the common home? There is no motive in life like the love of the dwelling place, unquote. This idealizing of the abode, which Nivedita holds up as a citizen's, quote, surpassing sanctity, is much more than the iconically separate, strewn private homes of each of us, distinct, separate, and splendid in their isolation. Like Rousseau, as cited in the beginning, and who held for all the contractary and right regions, houses make the town and citizens make the city. Nivedita has in mind the civic building under civic ownership, clearly modeled after the commune, which Nivedita says the communal palace, the property of all, being the home of the whole community, which is, according to her, transcends the family and the caste, and it clearly represents the consolidated civic mind in its breadth and depth. Quote, the scavenger who serves well the civic ideal of cleanliness is a better citizen than a Brahmin, if the latter serves only himself, unquote. The civic group mind and the personality of the city coinciding, or even becoming one with the common and the public, and more extravagant in Nivedita's denouncement of the private, remains unsurpassed in its power and force. But anyway, Nivedita in this endeavor, even if not wide in receiving support, is not alone. Since it was also the time when the newfound theory of societies, associations, and registered bodies had started creeping in our colony, it would be instructive to examine in brief a now forgotten classic which tries to delineate in agreement and disagreement with Nivedita why Sangha is not a commune but still is a spiritual collective. Now, here I actually try to read a book by Motilal Roy called Sangha Tattva, in which he tries to argue that this association is a wrong statement, wrong description of what we call Sangha. It's not the commune also. But it's a kind of Jivan Tattik, a kind of life theoretical manifestation of spontaneity in which, sort of people come together, and this is his description. The Indian theory of Sanghas is not a page from West communism. Curiously, Roy extends the family modeled upon the union of eternity between wife and husband, where two lives are continuously connected in a pure relation, not disrupted by earthly force, not terminated by death. So, Sangha, if we try to sort of derive it even from the Buddhist Motilal Rai tries to argue in those days, trying to argue that a life theoretical group is not dissolved like the groups of which was talked about by Haldar, a football club, a college. It's like the union of a husband and a wife, Here, instead of work, emphasis will be more on penance, requiring the whole of oneself to be symbolized collectively, where the collective as a symbol is the sole definitive object of worship. Leaving it here, we might not be surprised when marking the temporal episode of the colony and the post-colony, B.R. Ambedkar, while addressing the notion of the collective in fragments, also departs rigorously from the concept of the voluntary group. Yet he forcefully and reasonably so resists the idealized union conjectured to have been present in a mythical life community. For Ambedkar, marriage being a stratified intra-caste event can hardly act as a model. I mean, Motilal Rai's example, marriage, hardly act as a model to forge unity. This time his polemic will be directed against Gandhi, who seemed to have imbibed in himself much of the indigent spirit that Nivedita or Roy self-persuasively advocated and called for a unity with the roots of the broader narrative of the struggle against the British. Ambedkar's fatal question is, even if we have a good caste couple, would they be able to overcome, or would they be able to chasten by their forbearing the personality of the collective, which will be discriminatively domineering? The same argument of whole and part. Let us find the answer for ourselves. Ambedkar has been considered, as you know, he's a sort of great theorist of revenue from a lot of the Colombian star and kind of stuff. Now, he theorizes caste as an involuntary, social group, no voluntary membership, but subject to social regulation, tradition, over which he has no control of any kind. But here is that catch. The significance of a separate name for a caste lies in this, namely, it makes caste an organized and an involuntary grouping. A separate and a distinctive name for a caste makes caste akin to a corporation with a perpetual existence and the seal of separate entity. Now, while social groups, Ambedkar seems to be referring to the occupational groups, and their occupational classification has been used to designate castes in India. Ambedkar thinks this is clearly confusing, even misleading. He says social groups, potters, washermen, intellectual, other countries have remained as unorganized and voluntary groups, while in India they have become castes. Because in other countries the social groups were not given a name, while in India they did. It is the name which the caste bears which gives it fixity and continuity and individuality. And anybody interested in sophisticated continent theory will catch hold of this and talk a lot about naming, how it sort of name marks and gives birth to kind of entity. It is a name which defines who are its members, and in most cases a person born in a caste carries the name of the caste as a part of his surname. Again, it is the name which makes it easy for the caste to enforce its rules and regulations. So the norm becomes productive inasmuch as the offender cannot impersonate. His argument is rather interesting because legal identification, he says, becomes easy when in surname you bear a caste marker. How? It will help to identify the offending individual and the caste to whose jurisdiction he is subject, so that he is easily handed up and punished for any breach of the caste rules. This is what caste means. Meaning apart, if you are to study the caste system, we have to observe caste in interactive relation with other castes. An interesting departure would be to consider, following Ambedkar's suggestion, that the character of caste corporation would project a different personality than the constitutive caste members. Again, that argument. The character of caste corporation would project a different personality than the constitutive caste members or parts. And what kind of traits would the members imbibe or alter? They would be relation to one another endogamously, and also in relation to other caste members outside the group. All world is a caste-ridden world to them. The rest may appear as alien. Or we may surprise. Religion begins to our rescue at this point, where castes end. Ambedkar answers this question while trying to refute Gandhi's emphasis on personal character and proposed spiritual mimesis. By aping great spiritual leaders like Chaitanya, everybody could transform himself and transcend caste. And this is one of Gandhi's arguments. Ambedkar's point is simple. No outside specific individuation can work in the face of a domineering claustrophobic group individuation deriving from above, we may say, group personality. For a low caste member, any other caste neighbor would be construed as a higher or lower, or better or worse, but not a good man. And this is a great quotation from Ambedkar in which we can discuss more. How can we accept the personal character to make a man loaded with the consciousness of caste a good man? There is a man who would treat his fellows as his friends and equals. High caste man cannot be a good man insofar as he must have a low caste man to distinguish him as a high caste man. The best of men cannot be moral if the basis of relationship between them and their fellows is fundamentally a wrong relationship. To a slave, his master may be better or worse. but there cannot be a good master. A good man cannot be a master, and a master cannot be a good man. You could easily sort of trace this to Hegel's discussion of master and slave, where Koyev actually quotes this eloquently. The master is fixed in his mastery, cannot go beyond himself, change or progress. He can be killed, but cannot be transformed or educated. Koyev, deriving from Hegel, makes this point, which is eloquently brought up in Ambedkar, talking about a good caste man or a good master. Learning from and imitating Chaitanya would fail, says Ambedkar, because the caste group personality would not allow it. This is a point we have already made. That is to say, in reality, but caste as a corporation must justify some artificiality or fictionality, even while we want to explain this instance and do justice to the legal fiction theorists. Now, so far as legal fiction and legal fiction theorists are considered, I've brought out a quotation from Bentham, and it could be of some passing interest, but caste is a determinate real entity when it applies with sanction to the caste members now or before in existence. It is as much a fictitious entity, considered as applied to all or any or more of those individuals which, with that same specific character belonging to them, are considered as about to come into existence. Bentham's theory of fictions is invoked here to describe. Caste applies as if caste names persons who are supposed to come, who are in the future, and who are already dead and gone. Those in the past, and of course those in the present, right? It would be interesting to interpret Ambedkar's malady in view of Gandhi's suggestion as having to generate coevally the not yet with those who have already been. That is, those who are not yet are urged to ape those who are no more, or future asked to chase the past. And secondly, the real, those who have been present, in Bentham's language, determinate, being applied to fiction. Those are future indeterminate, those are supposed to come. Time is over? And thereby we might conjecture that not work because of that case will not work because of its imminent logical fallacy. But how was Ambedkar's caste as corporation theory received in social sciences in post-colonial India? A similar account, if you are able to locate it, might diminish some of the former's defamiliarizing effect and include and introduce more diversity and authenticity. Though this particular interpretation was not referred to, but the question of caste as group persons did feature in the writings of at least one lone sociologist from Bengal, Binoy Kumar Sarkar. Deriving from Panini's cryptic grammar, Sarkar designated Sangham, that Samoha Sangha on which Motilal Roy wrote a book, as having meant, quote, organized bodies of the Buddhist Asia. In fact, the aforementioned is a particular class of Samuham, and which were made up of those who lived at the same place but belonged to different social orders, the so-called castes, and followed different professions, unquote. Having addressed and included the castes, Sarkar wants to term these Samuha organizations as artificial civic bodies. This is Sarkar's phrase, artificial civic bodies, where Gana, Shreni and Varga, as illustrating and imbibing in them the, quote, juridical concept of a corporate person or one in the many, unquote, were little instances of the Greek polis. Clearly, such an ascription, and quite anachronistically that is reducing the taxonomy of legal fiction of juridical persons to institutions or associations of ancient India, is largely because sociology in India was at that earlier stage during that time. It was a disciplinary hyperbole. You cannot, kind of Germanic theory of legal corporations, if you attribute to ancient India. This is a bit of terminology anachronism, but the spirit. Indebted, and Sarkar is obliged to acknowledge at last Gierke, to which Maitland and all others are so very indebted, Gierke and Figgis. This makes his endeavor, even if not a correct one, yet a historically important exercise in terms of predicative conceptual labor. Though now we could comfortably rewind back to revisit the breakup of the Brahmo Samaj in colonial civil society, where the organization seemed to have assumed a spirit of its own and had started to interminably scare even its founder. Keshab Sen was flying away, escaping those principles of organization argument. He was not trying to face these arguments. which he had invoked for Rammohun Rai. The Haldar-McTaggart debate foregrounded the personality of associations and was stretched to its discursive consequences by Nivedita and later B.R. Ambedkar, to name two iconic, few among others, who deployed group personality to a heightened argumentative effect. That personnel could not be sacrificed to an impersonal civil social modernity, and secondly, remained determinately obstinate to resist the private in the latter's aggressive inward journey is a fact in place we ought to reckon with. So, I mean, by invoking juridical personality or personality of the groups or associations, I mean, if Weber's argument is that modernity is, the transition from impersonal, status-based, customary, organized life community to impersonal, procedure-based institutions, organizations, etc. By invoking juridical personality, legal fiction, and all these debates, the trajectory that I'm trying to, pit against the Weberian charting and all kinds of associations with it, is that it was a journey from personality to another form of personality, from the natural personality of individuals, whatever, to the personality of the groups or associations, right? And so far as the recent relevance, I think you have already had a sort of sense of it, because caste group, how members, could depart from caste or religion, how group rights could constrain individual rights. These debates are absolutely relevant. But apart from that, the kind of very different kind of relevance this kind of debate and this theory would have is in the event of, collective gang rapes and collective criminals, collective crime. This argument has been invoked somewhere else in contemporary juridical theory, is the concept of collective punishment. For instance, if you take today's Delhi gang rape and the trial of it, I think you might have followed it, and also the Park Street rape incident. Then Park Street case, for instance, the rape was said to have been committed by one. The others were, sort of helped him or were present. They could not prohibit. So the public prosecutor was a lady. She herself tried to argue that how could you sort of urge the same punishment because gang rape would have the same punishment for everybody, right? One had rape, particular. The culpability cannot be sort of conjoined or collaterally brought together and pegged on everybody, because all others are separate individuals. They have private liability or private responsibility in regard to their actions. How could you bring them together? So she asked for 10 years instead of capital punishment for the other who were there. This was essentially debated throughout. Even for the Delhi, in fact, for collective crimes, otherwise, even you will find the Maoists, for instance, debating the Maoist kind of punishment being talked about, even discussed by Foucault also, and many others. Where the collective punishments for instance, if there's a rape, during communal pogroms, if there is a rape, then how could you sort of locate each separate individual and ask for separate trials for separate consent, and how could you bring them together? Would that be a collective punishment, or how could you bring the group together? How could you bring the community together? Right? This is there. And secondly, whether this kind of collective punishment, if it could be really brought together, then the examples they cite is particularly so-called the terrorist or the fundamentalist organizations, when they actually mete out punishments, they are basically collective in nature. You make them sit together and make 10 people sit together and behead them together. So an evil example is brought to sort of explain. So the kind of argument of collective personality of groups is throbbing in relevance today and is highly being debated, but the consequences are yet not clear. I think this kind of argument and the exercise that I'm trying to do will help all of us to participate in that debate. Thank you.
Questions, comments? You need the mic?
No. I initiated it long before.
Yes.
There is some other people.
you want to re-ask that question? Or
No, I've asked him, and in a way he has sort of touched on it. No, but although, I mean, this is just a matter of discussion. I mean, couldn't exactly sort of understand how you are locating Nivedita in this wide context that you are sort of talking of. And you seem to sort of, at some point, bring Nivedita and Ambedkar on some plane. But, I haven't read Nivedita, to be very honest. But from what you said, like the way you began presenting Nivedita's case is that, a scavenger, if he is a good scavenger, is a bit better citizen than a Brahmin.
Yeah.
Now, I would think that Ambedkar would have problems with this kind of assessment, and you would think that this is an ideal way of incorporating the scavenger within the Brahminical whole. And Brahminical whole is a good case of the absolute as that you are pointing out, because there are participating elements, they might differ, but there is a transcendent or Brahminical spirit. So how are you then establishing a relationship through the concept of corporation between Ambedkar and Nivedita? Just point.
No, thank you. Yes, Nivedita, in fact, I think it's a clear case where Nivedita, while trying to talk about the civic, he talks about the civic corporation, and she takes a sort of model of the city as imbibing, the nation, sort of, and nationality also. But her theory of corporation is the city as a personality. Now, city as a personality, she argues elsewhere also, it transcends caste. But the examples that she gives, which you very rightly pointed out, that a good scavenger, in terms of dutifulness or cleanliness, is better than a Brahman. This kind of self-transcendence is absolutely negated by Ambedkar. But in terms of theory of corporation, this could be acknowledged. I mean, not in the sense it will acknowledge Nivedita, but it is very possible to say that the individuals can project a different personality. Then obviously, then the group would sort of be held responsible. I mean, even Ambedkar would say that if a caste man, lower caste man over commits a particular crime on a woman, for instance, but not necessarily that all caste members will do that, right? So this difference has to be acknowledged by Ambedkar as well. But what Ambedkar, in terms of corporation, is trying to take recourse to that kind of argument is that where the whole projects a different personality, and that personality will impinge upon all the members, and nobody could get out of it, obviously. And this is why he goes into a tirade against Gandhi, and I think he wins the argument. But Nivedita's central problem is not caste. Nivedita is talking about the city, and in fact, she has the model of the European cities and talks about the city in terms of Allahabad, Benares, and Calcutta, and denounces the post office, the railway station, which she thinks valorizes movement, speed, and transitoriness. But the dwelling in which we all come together in relationality and filiation, this homesickness is where she thinks the nationality thrives. And her, I think, argument, the really reigning metaphor is that civic corporations, because are national metaphors, they imbibe nationalism, it can transcend caste in that manner. But then the good scavenger is, of course, not a good example in terms of the scavenger, but that it can denigrate a Brahmin could be granted at least some point.
Yeah, but from what you were saying, actually puts Ambedkar and Nivedita even further apart. Because, Nivedita's critique of post office or the railway station is very close to Gandhi's critique of modern, associations, against which was Ambedkar. This is one thing. Second thing is by sort of raising this a spirit of corporation above the participants. Isn't, if Ambedkar has done that to the extent you were saying, isn't Ambedkar then leaning on? He has two options then. Lean on the dominant concept of the absolute, which in Hindu society is a Brahminical concept, or just go out of the Hindu fold, a complete cessation, and create a separate religion, for the lower castes, which he actually did, but he was very, very tentative, and he was actually warned by his own, comrades about it. So this kind of, 2 points here.
No, I think that we should mention, and be very clear about it, is that the notion of juristic personality or legal fiction, whatever, in corporation also. Corporation is one part of it. Firms are there, associations are there, groups are there, various kinds of voluntary associations are there, clubs are there. That they have personality, they can be defined as separate legal entities, this is one, apart from social. But they can be deployed in various forms. Nivedita is deploying in one form, of course. Not, it is the same manner, but they are invoking communal or group personality. This is my point. They are invoking both. But they can be deployed separately. Of course, Ambedkar's inheritance and Nivedita's inheritance, for instance, she gave a lecture in Kalighat, and she, of course, Tagore and all others were furious about that. Even Mahendralal Sarkar, the doctor of Ramakrishna, he was furious, and they wrote, they distributed leaflets. She was trying to justify animal sacrifice and all kinds of stuff. That is there, of course. But Nivedita, for instance, is very much an argument, is a national metaphor. The civic consciousness, civic personality is a national metaphor. Ambedkar's, nationality, if he could pose one, is a very different agenda. But both are talking about, corporate personality, communal personality, and they can be deployed differently, of course. Yeah.
I have two questions actually. In the very early part of your lecture, you pointed about this natural and the artificial personality, and the turn when this natural to artificial personality is emerging, particularly in the context of the Hegelian argument. But I would say rather it's basically this whole emergence of the mainstream of the Western Enlightenment, where the church and the state was divided. Although you are absolutely correct that the private is not the personal, so that's true. But I was thinking that whether this natural to artificial, and let's say whether this argument about group personality as a group having a personality, but that was also existing before the mainstream modernist enlightenment period. Suppose let's say in the medieval times,
of course.
Even in the late medieval times, you had very definite understanding about how the Jews were.
Absolutely.
Or how during the period of Crusades, how the Christians were, how the Muslims were. So I don't know whether, what are you hinting at? Is it a very original or fundamental change, or has it always been there? That there is always a certain moment of natural personality, there are certain moments of artificial personality. Whether they have actually existed. At what point of historical juncture that these two can be separated and identified and these two are separated?
Thank you, Mohidul.
Whether it's kind of over.
Mohidul, like one of the great interlocutors at IAS Shimla. But I'll finish this one, and then, because then the questions, while answering, people generally shortcut a lot of questions. They trump 2 or 3 and they answer one. So better I'll come. I was referring to medieval posturing of juristic theory. I did even Gierke, for instance, is basically a theorist of the medieval. Maitland, who translated Gierke's natural law and theory of society, was basically a medievalist, medieval English law later, and So of course it has had its origin mainly in medieval theory, no problem about it. But it has always been there in some sense, of course. But you see, the shift basically is in modernity and the classical theorists of modernity. I mean, take any continental philosopher, and where is legal personality? Where is juristic theory? Where is the fiction theory of authority? Not there. It's plotted as personal to impersonal rules, procedure. So, of course, I mean, that trying to recover these people, they were conscious. It was always present. Ambedkar basically, to go back to Manusda's point, Ambedkar talks about caste as corporation in one paragraph. But the way he continues, it could be obviously, I mean, a lot of argument could be made on trying to trace back to these theories. And so far as Jews is, that's a very interesting point because I could not discuss that. I mean, Hannah Arendt has an article, essay. In fact, it was a lecture, I suppose, where she talks about the Jews as paria. And Jews as paria, and where the Jews sort of could not be, even if brought together. But then, situation of the Jews. But the interesting point about Jews is when, this lecture on human values which takes place in particular university where somebody gave a lecture where she talks about her child talking about and then she's conversing with him that Jews were killed like animals. But she says, but doesn't mean, you'll argue that animals are killed like Jews. Right? So, of course, the Jew example is of course there. I mean, and so far as group personality is there, it was there, but it was not, the strange part is it was not used to describe or in fact to sort of cut across, to sort of remark on the classical plotting of modernity, number one. And number two, today also, I mean, while you invoke the Jews, the classical discussion on does not take recourse to. Now, this absence is a point to ponder about. And if my discourse could sort of incite in all others to think about why this absence is, because even in Tagore you will find a lot of references where she talks about law courts, legal indeterminacy. She talks about it as why people engage in litigation, because they get the fun as if they're indulging in a lottery, to describe legal indeterminacy in litigation. And Tagore also, in various forms, he is in his essays where he's most interesting, talking about this. Yeah, that is, we have to read against the grain and invoke these people. Yeah, your second question.
Yeah. So you ended the lecture by saying that it's basically the individual person who is responsible for all.
No, I'm not saying, but this has been a point of litigation.
Yeah. Basically, it's a political argument. But I guess that the point is that the question of law, particularly modern law, is essentially then becomes more liberalism centric.
Exactly. Our law is absolutely private citizens' law.
That's right.
Yep,
Now in this case, and how the problem is when you have a liberalism which is individual centric, but at the same time you have a liberalism, the same liberalism. At the same time, it also celebrates multiculturalism and then group rights and then personal laws. So I guess there is this problem because of course you cannot understand the world comprehensively only through the liberal prism. So I guess the idea of collective is important. And
of course, I mean the liberal grasp.
There is the chasm, and how you then address that kind.
No, the liberal grasp is overwhelming, breathtaking. Yeah, absolutely right. But then the question is like that Hiralal Haldar asks, quoting Bosanquet, where does the self end and the environment begin? That is very sort of, if that is very sort of vigorous and very sort of uncharted, then you have to say this is something which is not liberal. If it talks about private rights, it basically should be individual centric. It should talk about private rights. Liberalism is basically about it. But then it can talk about group rights, but so far as it does not infringe on private rights. And that is where I elsewhere in a Bengali article where I had argued, and part of it is coming out, where, for instance, in other, say in Middle East, in Pakistan also, I mean, where you have collective whipping. Now, the moment this is reported here, people are, oh, it's medieval, it's dangerous. But the point is, in terms of the liberal, theory of punishment, you cannot understand this. Why 4 people could be flogged together? Right? You have to have an understanding of a group in a very medieval and very different sense. And not necessarily that the way we have, torture custody in a sacred torture chamber. This is the best way to organize and inculcate punishment. Like Nietzsche, for instance, was the best person who understood this. He defined punishment as a social distribution of cruel delight. Right? So, human rights, for instance, is a good predicament where this indifference to suffering becomes absolutely crucial. Because if I make you suffer, I have human rights intact. If I suffer, I have human rights intact. Right? If I sort of inflict pain on you, I still have human rights. If I am pained, still I have human rights. So human rights have to be indifferent to this kind of suffering. Because it grasps all and everybody. Now, if human rights is liberal, of course it has been critiqued as liberal, imperial, Western universals. But still, I mean, there are pragmatic and didactic explanations and engagements of that kind of human rights. Though they are trying to trace Arvind Sharma's work, for instance, tries to trace human rights in the Hindu discourse. But I don't think that human rights could be ascribed to Hinduism and Hinduism.
Arnab, just you know it better than me because you have been working in this. When I torture him, I might be having my human rights, but I'm violating his human rights. This is what human rights people say. And to the extent I'm violating his human rights, I'm violating collective right as well. Because human rights is not beyond collective rights. So you cannot say that my human right remains intact even if I win.
No. Generally, for instance, certain kind of, if I confine you, right? Now, if I put you under confinement, now, if this is a violation of a statutory violation, then I could be punished, for instance, I could be confined, right? But one may not, for instance, the particular right that I violate, it's not necessarily my right is violated thereby.
But my right is in liberal theory, my right is a negative right.
The whole
thing is constructed on negative right.
Negative, I mean, Berlin is basically talking about a negative freedom, negative liberty, right? Yeah. Negative rights are very different from negative liberty.
Negative right is basic.
What I'm saying is human rights. There are certain rights which could be relinquished, certain rights which are, if you commit certain things, you are actually abandoning certain rights. Certain rights could be taken, you are putting that under suspension by the virtue of your act. But human rights, because of its universal transcendence and permanence, you cannot suspend that at any time. This is the point which has been raised by the critics of human rights.
Yeah, but that is take it in a different frame. That makes violation of human right a constant feature, a constant presence. And mind you, have a very good point. Human rights is different from other forms of right because this is the right you have which is inalienable to you, and therefore it's a theocratic remnant of the modern era. Fine enough. But it's humans giving humans human right. So it's also a construct which is different from the theological side of it.
Theology are also natural law.
Natural and theological would be here. But the thing is, because you are a human being and therefore ontologically you have this right, which also makes violation of that right, something that needs to be constantly present. Like you have to monitor whether that right has been violated. So this is it. Even if you have disappeared, suppose you are in the forest. You are nowhere to be seen. Your human rights remain with you and they can be violated there. Therefore, you become a candidate of possible violation of human rights at any point of time or any point
But
of
that's
space.
why the question even in the prisoners in the Guantanamo Bay.
Yes.
We don't know what is happening, but
Yeah,
when
exactly.
the news are
This is
leaking,
this
and
opaque case.
that's the opaque case.
Okay.
At the same time, you see the public viewing thing, one could actually then question this, this Saddam Hussein's public hanging, which was actually live telecast. So
That was a secret recording. Mohidul, Saddam's hanging.
There something else has happened.
Yes.
The liberal edifice has projected Saddam Hussein as non-human.
Non-human.
Yeah.
No,
So that is exactly what
I mean, Saddam's hanging was a secret recording, right? It was not. It was never.
No, but it was then.
No, but product of a secret reading, you cannot translate it to becoming a spectacle. It was not a public. You have to acknowledge. Now, secondly, losing oneself in a forest or general violation of civil rights, political rights, or a criminal wrong, criminal infraction. Now, mind it. When actually civil or criminal infraction happens, when standing statutory civil or criminal rights fail, laws fail, then only human rights is invoked. So particular kind of fractions, violations, which are basically everyday instances, everywhere, all the time, human rights cannot be invoked. It can be invoked because it is transcendent to all kinds of particularities, and it is permanent, and it grasps everywhere all the time, right? Now, I think the point after this is very simple. Why, for instance, Marx, as you know, basing himself on the Jews, criticized the Universal Declaration and human rights? This is basically the argument that human rights, the global, the grand narrative of human rights, it should be there, it is there, but the particular empirical instances and the configuration of violation and the law cannot be subsumed under human rights. But while the rubric is broad enough to have subsumed that, right? So there is a contradiction, but this contradiction should live, despite the fact that it could be traced to natural law or theological origins. Yeah.
Thank you, Arnab.
Thank you.